Hey everybody, I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I'm not turning off my garden tank light. We're not going to move the camera around. I'm actually getting ready to do a water change here on my T-bar tank, and I want to just shoot the whole thing on video, start to finish, more or less. I've already turned the filter off. We're not going to do a filter change or anything. We're just going to do a simple water change in and out. I might wipe the glass down a little bit while I'm in there, may do a little plant trimming. I don't know, but that's just the point. You're going to get to see my whole process. So sit back and relax. I got to run in the other room and get the siphon hose started, and etc., etc. So I'll be a moment, but I'll be right back. So to get this started, I bring it in mostly full of water already, and then just lay it in without pouring the water out, and then that way I can get the hose in there and have it completely full of water rather than air. And I don't know whether you can see it or not, but I tuck it between the Gourami tank and the side of the T-bar tank, and it allows me to keep the hose from kinking. So now I got to go get it started. Now what I do is, instead of just opening the valve at the sink, I unscrew it at the sink and take it into the bathroom in the other room, and I just lay the hose in the shower stall down at ground level, and that lower elevation, the further you're getting the water to fall, the more suction you get on your siphon. So if I were to just open the valve and let it drain into the sink, the height of the sink valve is probably right here. I mean, I don't even think the tank would fully drain before we got to an equilibrium where there was no more suction at all. So in this case, if I were to forget, the tank will drain as far down as the hose will allow. So if the hose were able to push all the way to the bottom, that's how far the tank could drain, because I am draining right to the floor. So one of the issues I have with these hoses is the way I have it hanging in the sink. I always get like a kink right in the neck, and it really restricts the flow of water. So once I get that sort of squeezed and widened open, I can get a little bit of gravel vac action going here. This tank always has giant fish poops in it from my big pleco I've gotten here. And a lot of times, in fact, they're so big that they don't even want to go up in the gravel vac. They actually are too heavy to float. I've actually sort of got to crunch it and mush it up a little bit to break it into small enough pieces to rise up in the water column through the gravel vac. So that is definitely a benefit of using, regular old gravel vac in a 5-gallon bucket. For as nice as this is, and for as easy as it makes doing water changes, as far as the ease of draining the tank and ease of refilling the tank, that's all well and good. But if you've got some serious vacuum to do and you really need some good suction, then these kinds of water changers aren't necessarily the best. I think of this more as a water changer than I do a gravel vac. But you can use it as a gravel vac. Now I'm not going to go any further down because I got some algae wafers. I'm actually already starting to suck up some of the algae wafers I put in there for dinner tonight. So there's no point in removing the stuff I've already put in there. So we'll just try to break up a little more of this fish poop. Plecos are messy, messy fish. See if you can see this stuff right here. This is actually algae wafer that just sat on that Anubias leaf and never fell to the bottom. So I'm not trying to win like the Good Housekeeping Award here or anything. I don't care if I get every last little bit of it out of here. You know, I think about it in terms of if I hadn't done a water change tonight, all of it would still be in here. So the fact that I'm removing any of it is better than it would have been. So we've still got a bunch down at this end. This is one of the benefits of the way I've got my tanks set up. I actually do this deliberately, and I'll discuss that in half a moment here. Let me get this while I'm working on it, try to avoid knocking into my snail there. I got a big old clump of the debris here that doesn't want to scoop out. Another thing you can do is, like in this case, I'm assuming you can see the gravel vac there. Let's say I've got a bunch of stuff that's in the vac and it won't really go up and I can't really get it to go out. What you can do is get it up into the column a little bit and then turn the vac over. You can even pull it up out of the water if you have to, as long as you get it back down in the water before the air gets up into the hose. And that allows you to get all that bigger junk out of there that you can't normally, or you know, that wouldn't come up with the suction power. So the way I set my tanks up, and I have just about all of them set up the same way, is I keep my filter intake on this side, and it's just, for me, I don't know if it's visually or whatever, the right hand side of the tank is usually where I've got my filter intake, and then the left hand side of the tank I have a power head blowing across the back of the tank. So the filter discharges sort of forward and up, so I get this kind of water circulation across the front glass, and that keeps this stuff sort of up and in the water column, and then the power head keeps the water flowing around this way, and then that sort of carries the stuff in the back to the filter intake. The stuff that goes past the filter intake gets down to this end of the tank, and this is the slowest moving end of the tank, where the water just sort of collects and eddies and everything falls. And visually it might not look the greatest. If you walk in, you can see all the fish poop and everything sort of right there. But when you've got a tank that's got this much junk in it, to come in here and simply do what I just did, and that's pretty much it. I did a pretty thorough gravel vacuuming, all of it kind of right here. That's deliberate. That's the way I've got this set up. And I tinkered with different ways of doing it, having the thing flowing up and having it squirting this way and having it blowing around the opposite direction. And I sort of worked out that this kind of setup is what works best for me. May not work for you. It's something to think about. It's something to consider. Or just simply trying to find what does work for you, knowing that there's options and that the way you set up your power head and where you position your filter, all of those things do make a difference in overall tank maintenance. You know, I made the mistake early on to set up tanks the way they looked good. And while that's fine, having to maintain them is a different story, and having to get in there and get the, you know, the debris and the detritus that collects on the bottom. And if you look at my black ghost knifefish tank that started out as my African tank years ago, the decor in that tank and the shape and everything hasn't changed at all since I set it up. And that was the first tank I really put some thought into setting up. And it wasn't bad. It was certainly better than some of my earlier attempts, which were just huge cluttered messes, just piled with rocks, and you know, they looked good, but they were disasters to maintain and take care of, or to remove fish from. They were almost impossible. And then I set up my African tank, which is currently my black ghost knifefish tank, and I got close. You know, I got closer. It's a good looking tank. It's not impossible to maintain, but it's still way more cluttered and difficult. There's way too many dead zones. There's way too many spots where the water sort of swirls and eddies and leaves big clumps of detritus on the bottom that I can't get to with the gravel vac. The best way to deal with that is to use my hand to stir it up into the water column while I'm doing a water change, and then try to get as much of it out while it's swirling around in the water. You know, that's not an ideal way. This is nice. This collects right here, and I can vac it out of there. Something similar happens in my gudgeon tank, my 125. I don't really ever have to do a lot in the way. That's so open that everything sort of gets taken up into the filter. I never really have stuff collect in that tank at all. This tank just has so much vegetation in it, and it's such a small tank You can see this little piece of Java here drifting by. It's got some decent water circulation in it, but that's not enough to keep, you know, fish waste suspended in the water column and keep it moving around until it gets picked up by the filter. It's enough water to call it decent circulation so that I don't have any, you know, oxygen dead zones, or, you know, zones where the gas exchange doesn't happen properly or whatever. Don't have any of those kind of issues in my tank, but I definitely don't have enough water flow in this tank to keep all of the waste suspended. My Gourami tank does, believe it or not, but my Gourami tank also has more fine sand on the bottom, and the sand allows for better water current flow, and the stuff again doesn't have as much stuff to get caught in and stuck on, so having a sandy substrate will make a difference when it comes to that sort of stuff. So I'm going to get started on wiping the glass down. Now that we're far enough from the surface, I don't feel too bad about opening the lid. I don't like having the lids open with my hatchet fish in there. They're jumpers, and especially in a situation like this, it's very easy to see how they could be startled. But now that we got a little bit of gap between the surface of the water and the open tank, I'm going to run in the other room and get some batting, and then I'll be right back and we'll get the glass wiped down. Alright, nothing particularly special about this. This tank doesn't have a whole lot in the way of the really tough stuff to get off. My Gourami tank's got that green spot algae growing in there, and so when I get in there, I've really got to put some elbow grease into some certain spots here and there to really make sure I get it. This one just has mostly that green algae that grows rapidly but also wipes right off, so it's not that big of a deal. And then of course I do have a few spots of the green algae, the green spot algae. Don't know how well that's coming on camera, but if you can see these little green dots, that's the green spot algae. See, here's a bunch of them, those little green dots, and as you can see, I'm wiping right across them and they're barely coming off. If you rub a piece of plastic over that, you can actually hear it sort of clicking over it, and it generally takes either a razor blade or, again, a little bit of elbow grease. Fortunately, I used to be a massage therapist, so I'm pretty good at applying pressure with my hands in a way that doesn't actually tire my hand out too bad, and I can apply quite a bit of pressure if I need to. So I generally don't use razor blades when I clean my tank. In this case, I'm not overly concerned about getting every little spot of that stuff off of there. I will also caution that depending on what kind of substrate you have, most of them, and if you don't know for sure, assume yours will do this, but most substrates will scratch your glass. I've had discussions in the past with people about steel scraping implements and razor blades scratching your glass and stuff like that. Standard steel is not hard enough to scratch your glass. Now if you've got carbide steel or something like that that's been hardened, that's a different story. If you're, but just standard razor blades, a metal scraping tool you would buy for your aquarium, that's not going to be carbide or anything like that. So that's just simply not hard enough to scratch glass. You just can't do it. I don't care what you do. You can't physically scratch glass with a piece of standard steel. And a razor blade is certainly not going to scratch your glass. The minerals in your substrate, however, are a very different story. If you've got gravel that's genuine gravel, that will scratch your glass. This stuff here, this is my Carib Sea, and this will scratch glass easily. I've done it before. The only stuff that won't is if you've got like coconut husk or something like that on the bottom, or if you've got the faux, what they call aquarium gravel at your big chain pet stores, which is really like a dense plastic foam that looks like gravel, but if you actually squeeze it or press your thumbnail into it, you can dent it. It's a very soft material, but it's dense enough that it sinks and it's inert, so it doesn't harm your fish or affect your water chemistry, and at a quick glance it can pass for gravel. It's the same stuff I've got in my 29 miscellaneous, and it is definitely not gravel. That won't scratch your glass. Other than that, I would assume any kind of aquarium substrate out there will scratch your glass. So be really careful when you're getting down along those bottom edges. If you get down there, this kind of material will pick up the tiniest little pieces of that stuff, and you may not even see it in there, but the next thing you know, you're hearing this weird scratchy sound and you're feeling this weird scrapey feeling in your hand, and you look down and you now have a line across your glass in your fish tank that you can never get rid of. So be really careful about inadvertently getting some gravel picked up in your rag or towel or your batting or whatever material you're using. Even if you're using a razor blade or a scraping tool, that's something to be careful with. If you've got a razor blade and it's flat against the glass and you go all the way to the edge of the substrate, when you come back up, if any of that substrate has swirled around and you now picked up some, and you're sliding that substrate up the glass with the razor blade, that will scratch it. It's the substrate you've got to be careful with, not the razor blade. All right, everybody, it's time to start refilling it. I'll be right back. So this is the part where having that water changer comes in handy. It's the refilling it. It's one of the flowers from Nubius. Now keep in mind, I have well water, and in addition to it being well water, it's not straight out of the groundwater. It has gone through my water system and has been adjusted for pH and hardness and everything else. So I can just hook the hose directly back up to my sink and turn it on and get the temperature adjusted correctly and let it go. And as long as I don't forget that the tank is filling and walk away, then we'll be okay. Now I don't see any more flowers that need to be trimmed out of there. I'm looking for any dead pieces of Java fern, anything like that that might need to come out. I do see a bunch of stuff stuck on the power head. I can get down here, get that loose. All the stuff that grows in that will actually reduce the water flow. And this has quite a bit of stuff in there actually. It's got the some Java moss got in this tank. I don't know how. The Java moss was actually starting to grow on that, and that was really restricting the water flow. So now we've got a lot more water flow. You can actually see some of the bits of algae wafer from earlier starting to pick up and move across the bottom, and that was just from clearing off that power head a little bit. So if you've got city water, or municipal water of some sort that's actually got chlorine or chloramine in it. Chloramine is a little different than chlorine. Chloramine is chlorine with an ammonia bound to it, I want to say. I'll have to double check and look into that. It's been a while since I've looked at the water treatment and all that kind of stuff. But the chloramine is there to be longer lasting than the chlorine. Chlorine does not have a lot of staying power in your water. It evaporates very quickly. It breaks down very quickly. So while it renders your water safe, and I'm not in any way knocking it, and nobody else should be either, the countless untold billions of lives that have been saved by treated water is nothing compared to a little bit of inconvenience when refilling your aquarium. So no harm in treating the water, but if it's been treated, you still need to know that, and you still need to deal with that appropriately when you get your when you're doing your water change. So chloramine will actually linger in your water longer than chlorine will. So it's not a bad idea to know what exactly you've got going on in your water, and you can just go online and look up whatever your municipal water is. They by law, at least here in the United States, they by law have to tell you what's in your water. So it'll break down whether there's chlorine in it or there's chloramine in it. It'll tell you how much, how many parts per million, and so on and so forth. So knowing whether you've got chlorine or chloramine is important, and then knowing how to deal with it is important too. So if you're using one of these water changers and you're just running water from your tap right back into your tank, well, you're putting the chlorine and stuff in there. So you've got to probably use, I would guess, Prime or one of those, they call them dechlorinators, but they're not really dechlorinators. And that's the point I want to make, is when you're using them, they only last for a certain amount of time. And what they do is they take ammonia, that's what I'm thinking of, is the ammonia blocker. Let me make sure I know what I'm talking about here before I continue rambling on any further. I'm just talking myself into a corner without even thinking about what I'm saying. I think I'm getting ammonia and the ammonia blockers from doing like a nitrogen cycle and setting up a tank confused with the chlorine blockers and how the chlorine blockers work. The chlorine blockers are designed to give you a few days for the chlorine to simply evaporate out of the tank. That's what it is. And the ammonia blockers basically bind the ammonia with hydrogen, and they turn it into ammonium. And then that gives your nitrogen cycle a few days to deal with it before it breaks apart and turns back into ammonia. So in either case, you're dealing with a limited period of time before it's not doing its thing anymore. So keep that in mind when you're doing water changes. You need to know about whether it's chlorine or chloramine, because chloramine lasts longer. And that's the point I'm really trying to get to, is that the chloramine lasts longer than chlorine. So if you're setting your tank up and you're letting it set for X amount of hours and all that because you think you've got chlorine in there, and it turns out you've got the chloramine takes a lot longer to get out of your tank. And again, I think chloramine is ammonia and chlorine combined, and that's where I got confused with talking about the ammonia blocker and Prime and all that kind of stuff, setting up a nitrogen cycle when you're setting up a tank. So anyway, I'm not really in a position to talk about that a whole lot anyway, because I, as you can see, don't have to worry about any of that. I simply do a dump and fill. I just dump a bunch of water out of the tank and then fill it back up, and then that'll be the extent of the water change. So I could probably actually just wrap this video up. I don't really see a whole lot of point in making, it never hurts to just check, make sure I didn't accidentally overheat or underheat the water, but it's still fine. Again, there's just not a whole lot of point in the rest of this video. All we're going to do is simply sit here and wait until the water is topped off, and then at that point I'll take the hose out, and that'll be the end of the video, or the end of the water change. So I guess we waited this long, we may as well just go ahead and do the whole thing, and then you'll officially see an entire water change start to finish uninterrupted. Now of course you did miss me unplugging the filter right before we started, but that's literally all I did was unplug the filter to stop it from running so it doesn't suck air in while we've got the tank refilling. Now I will also remind people or point out that my regular viewers will remember I just bought a brand new Aqueon water changing system the other day because my hose got a hole in it. And I bought the new one, spur of the moment. I just assumed it was time. It's been years since I've got this, you know, had this one in there. And so I bought it, and in the meantime, while I was waiting for it to ship, I realized that I've already patched a hole in this one before. And it was the same type of situation. I do so many water changes so frequently, and I am so far away from anything like a neat freak, that this hose literally just lives on my basement floor. It just stays hooked up to the sink, and when I'm done this water change, this end of it will go back into the sink, so that, you know, both ends are still in the utility sink in the other room, but the hose itself will be sprawled out all across my basement floor, and we just do our best to sort of avoid stepping on it. But it gets stepped on all the time. And when I first got it years ago, I didn't realize that, like, you should avoid stepping on it. I thought it's soft vinyl, it's not going to hurt it at all. And it didn't take long of just walking on the hose before I actually developed a kink, you know, where the hose was starting to crack. And so I patched it with a product called Shoe Goo and just regular old black electrical tape. And Shoe Goo, I'll see if they sell Shoe Goo on Amazon. I'm sure they do, and if they do, I'll put a link down below. I am an Amazon affiliate. If you click on any of those links and buy anything on Amazon through those links, I actually get a couple of pennies for that purchase, so that always helps me out. If you're purchasing anything from Amazon, you know, if you can do that through one of my links, that sends a couple pennies my way. But at any rate, I use the Shoe Goo. It's quite obviously a product for repairing tennis shoes, rubber shoes, you know, gluing the soles back on or whatever. And it's a really, really high strength, sticky rubber cement-like goo that hardens or cures into a firm yet pliable sort of rubber. And all I did was smear a little bit on where the crack was, and then wrapped it tightly with the electrical tape, and I let it sit overnight, and I never had another leak from that spot again. And that was years ago. So after realizing that, I went ahead and did the exact same thing to the crack that I found the other day, and likewise I haven't had a drop of water leak out of it since. So I now have 2 patches on this particular hose, but I've also got a brand new unopened in the box hose sitting on the shelf waiting for the day I do have some sort of disaster, and this is out in the yard for some reason and I run over with the lawnmower by accident, or who knows. But the day this thing gets destroyed, I'll have a backup. So I'm not too worried about it. I'm not going to bother returning it or anything like that. I'll just keep it in the other room and I'll have myself a backup. But after all that and shooting the video and talking about it and everything else, I wound up not even using it anyway. I'm still using the original hose that I've been using for, well, for many years now. I guess maybe 4 years now, something like that. Alright, let's get the lid over here closed now that we're getting some depth in there. And once the filter is, or once the water level's up above where the surface skimmer is, I can go ahead and get the filter plugged back in, and we'll get that up and running again. And so that's the filter running. If you shut it off before you start and close that valve, you don't even get any bubbles in the filter. So if you're not going to do a filter change, you can do that, and then when you start it back up, it's that simple. There's no pumping, there's no bubbles, there's no nothing. So I just wait until you can't see any more air and the water is up above this black line right here. It's not perfectly level, so this corner is the corner that needs to top off, and now it's done. And that is it. So now I just take this back in the other room.
And that's that. So the last thing I will do to make this officially a whole entire water change video, that's officially an entire water change video, start to finish. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hope you enjoyed. Make sure you're subscribed, that way you won't miss anything. You never know what it's going to be with me. Might be something exciting like this, or it might not. You never know. Anyway, don't forget, this one here is my 55-gallon T-bar tank. Thanks again, and I will see you real soon in the next one.